The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliyatambi. Well, US President Donald Trump certainly opened a Pandora's box when he implemented these sweeping tariffs worldwide and plunged the world into chaos economically, and we don't know where it will end. Will there be a recession? Will it be even worse than a normal recession? We all hope, though, that the trade war that is going on now, especially that between China and the US, will be sorted out and that saner counsel will prevail. But let's look beyond all this. Once the dust settles, what will the new global economic order look like? For nearly a century, the world's economy was dominated by the United States. But other countries like China have been closing that gap quite rapidly in the past couple of decades. And now, with this trade war, the world may decide to go its own way on a different path to the old-style American economics. Now, to discuss all this, I have with me this evening Mr. Dhanusha Pathirana, well-known economist. Good evening and welcome,
Good
Dhanusha.
evening. Thank you so much.
Right, Dhanusha. So right now, we don't know what's going to happen even in the next hour, let alone the next day or the next week. It's all in flux. We don't know what's happening between various countries, regions. There's realignment of alliances, economic alliances, which may lead to realignment of military alliances all over the world. But what will be the outcome of all this? What will be the economic model that the world will need to follow or will experiment with after the dust has settled? And for about a century, American-style economics seemed to be the way to go. That's what we were told, and the Western world marketed this model, and other models such as communism, which the Soviet Union tried, did not work. But now we see that the United States itself has crippled its own model. So what are we looking at? What will the future economy of the world look like?
Yeah, I think, Niresh, to understand the current context, I think best way is to take a few lessons from the history where we see similar patterns that happen, because what we see right now is like people are in utter shock, as if something like this has never happened in the world, and so they are completely baffled about what lies ahead, given the situation that we are right now in with Trump's devastating taxes on rest of the world. But if we go, we don't have to go back far into the history. If we take the United States itself, just after the Great Depression, or when the Great Depression kicked off in 1929, in 1930 they introduced the Smoot-Hawley Act. And the Smoot-Hawley Act doubled down on import tariffs, which were already high.
That's an act of Congress which was meant to protect
the domestic industries
US
and
industry.
Basically prevent mostly the imports that are coming in, so that they keep the domestic markets to the industrialists. So they raise import taxes on average from 40 to 47%. So right now, I think the taxes are not up to that level, actually, if we take the entire average. But of course, we see China has been hammered down by close to 245% taxation. And even before that, in 1922, they introduced another act, 1922 Tariff Act, which again on certain commodities they increased the tariff up to 400%. So these are what we call beggar thy neighbor policies, which were introduced to actually advance themselves at the expense of your partners or trading countries in the rest of the world. This was basically how the 19th century and the 20th century, early or first half of the 20th century was formed. And this is how these countries actually developed, through industries. It's not the free trade model that has been pushed down our throats. So it's nothing new to these countries. That's, I think, first of all, we should get that all cleared.
Right. In fact, if I may take you back even further, when you look at these Western countries and you look at how they got rich, it is not really through trade and commerce, not the free market. It was more by conquest. These are empires. I mean, whether it's the British, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, the Germans, the Russians, these were all empires which profited from their conquests. And even the United States, with its, I mean, it has a long history of expansion throughout the Caribbean and the Philippines and so on, and of course its history of slavery and so on, which of course at the time most countries in the world were following. So they didn't actually get rich through these free market policies. So they got rich, and then they came up with this model for the world to follow.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Now,
I know I'm simplifying things here, but
yes,
it was never a level playing field.
Absolutely. The initial, capital that was required to boost their industries was, significantly being supported by the colonial conquests and the looting that took place. But when it comes to their industries, what they did was they resorted to exploiting the raw materials in the periphery in order to boost their industrial output. And mostly, like you said, during this, specifically in the 19th and in the early 20th century, now even if you take up to 1950, United States exports are just 5% of their entire GDP. So that means to say they reached up to that level of development mostly through their internal demand. And it was after the post-World War era, after the Second World War, that this trade became more and more important. So now it occupies something like 15% of US GDP. But the whole history before that has something completely different to the model that they are following right now. And now the model that is now, which is about to go into a huge crisis when these taxes come into play, let's say another 3 months' time, if at all they come into play. So the other point I think we should also highlight is that the role of the global currency and how it affects the United States. I mean, while it also boosts their power, the global influence, and bringing in so many economic advantages, it brings with it certain other disadvantages also. We saw
you're talking about the US dollar being the world's reserve currency.
World's reserve currency. So we saw that with the British sterling pound. What happened to the sterling? So what we, from the history of these models, what we see is that even within empires, there were two fundamental models when it comes to these, especially managing an economic empire. One is the British model, which we saw collapsing, The other is the one that is not so talked about is the German Nazi model. Despite them not having so many colonies, they still had a sphere of influence within Europe, especially in the Eastern European region and the Central European region, and also some parts in Africa. So I think it would be important to understand the current context if we just take a couple of minutes to look into this. Now, when British accumulated deficits with its trading partners, so what it had what we call the a sterling bloc of trading countries, where it was the sterling that was used to trade. So whenever Britain accumulated deficits with their colonies, they demanded those colonies to deposit the surplus in London banking system, so that although they are in a trade deficit, their balance of payments will not be deteriorating.
So even up to today, London is the banking center of the world in many respects, although there are now many banking centers, but that's one of the reasons that London grew so rich.
Right. So now that is the basic framework which United States has now is now implementing. But the Germans had a different method. Whenever the Germans accumulated deficits, they by force wanted their partners to purchase their goods so that the deficits completely vanish. So the two methods. So during the Great Depression, actually Germans flourished. It was called the German economic miracle. They had a completely separate system of economic management through central planning by their central banker called Hjalmar Schacht. Actually, he was one of the main influences of this Keynes. Keynes learned from him, and then without so much of sourcing, and planned the British economy during the Second World War, the whole economic planning to keep especially the inflation down. So now what United States is doing, it's trying to in a way push down into that German model through these taxes, and you're forcing, like putting the foot down and forcing these other countries to now buy from United States. If not, they are going to hammer you down through these tariffs. So, but as we see, that will not be so easy, and so many countries will resist, and that is what we saw, especially through tariffs. Now in 1930s, there was a tariff war. When United States brought the Smoot-Hawley Act, there was retaliatory tariffs, and then it led to also a currency war. So, and the other point that I think we should also see, during the Nixon shock was far more devastating than what we are seeing currently. In 1971, when the Bretton Woods collapsed, due to these accumulation of deficits, and it was mostly that United States went on thrashing communists and killing communists, and spent money on Vietnam War. So these type of accumulated their deficits, and therefore their dollar reserves were not enough to, the gold reserves were not enough to back the gold standard. Therefore, Nixon abruptly in 1971 decided that, okay, we are going to impose 10% tariffs on all rest of the world, because you guys are like what now Trump is doing now. Like, you are currency manipulators. Now your currencies must be appreciated, that you are undervaluing, and then they depreciated their currency right throughout, and imposed taxation, and also completely dismantled the gold standard. So that was $35 for troy ounce of gold. That was the exchange rate, fixed rate. So when that whole system collapsed.
I'm sure the world has changed. Now, if you take the time of Nixon, the US was an enormous superpower, and I'm not even talking militarily, economically. And the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, was quite weak. So that was, the big market, and that's not so today.
Exactly.
The rest of the world is trading, and if you look at population dynamics, you know, the United States has less than 350 million people, but there are 8 billion living on this planet.
Yeah.
I mean, 350 million is nothing or very little compared to the 1.5 billion in India and the 1.4 billion in China.
Yeah. But then again, Niresh, now with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the power of the United States or global dominance multiplied. Now, this was a very key turning point in the future course of the United States global power, and also the state of the economy, because it was a double-edged sword, one you could say, because on one hand, of course, we know that it increased its global influence and all the power that it accumulated, but on the other hand, it had to play the role of the absolute global trading currency. If I give you some data on this, in 1995, the entire foreign exchange transactions in the world, 45% took place through the United States dollar by 1995. But right now, even though we are saying the US dominance is in a decline, 88% of global trade or global foreign exchange transactions are happening through the United States dollar. In 1990, it was 41%. So what happened was that they have to issue currency to finance other people's trades also. So how would others get hold of all these dollars? Obviously, they will have to run a trade deficit, or otherwise they have to run some form of capital outflows in the financial account. That's what we see. We see about 1 trillion flowing out every year from the United States. So while this is also strengthening their global influence, it is also creating what we call something like a Dutch disease situation. That is to say, when you have an infinite flow of cash through this type of mechanism. Now, the Dutch disease idea was introduced to understand in the 1980s when I think Netherlands found oil. So it actually brought in so much of capital into the country so that their currency started appreciating, right? So then the rest of the industrial structure became uncompetitive, because not only uncompetitive, because your currency keeps on appreciating, you can't actually plan ahead when a situation like that arises. So say you can actually relate this to United States. You can see United States dollar, despite the deindustrialization. So for instance, they had about quarter of its output in manufacturing by the mid 80s. Right now it is less than 10%. So a significant decline in industry and industrial jobs. Despite all this, its currency keeps appreciating. So it's almost like a Ponzi scheme where theoretically, where if there's an infinite flow of cash, your assets do not really need to function. So for instance, you don't really need to export for your system to run smoothly. But the pressure to change all this comes from the working and the middle class, because they are the ones who are actually suffering, because ultimately when the industrial jobs vanish, what we call precariousness kicks in to the labor market. Your job security, your working hours become extremely long, and low wage paying jobs become the order of the day, and that is to say the living conditions rapidly decline despite the accumulation of wealth. I mean, you see the number of billionaires that came up, and I think so. Then we can point out about the type of investments or type of businesses which came up during the last 1 or 2 decades in the United States. Now, if we take a company like Google, Google has a revenue of roughly $370 billion. That is almost 4 times that of our country. But how many people are they employing? they employ less than 200,000 people. So for an income that is almost 4 times that of Sri Lanka. So then which is roughly enough to sustain 4 times our population, right?
So
but
in that sense, we are doing a better job than Google, because now your example is basically showing the gap between the haves and the have-nots in the US has been increasing, and that is what has brought upon political pressure, and Donald Trump rode that wave into office. Now, we need to take a short commercial break. We will delve into this haves and have-nots situation in the US after we come back from this break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
The People's Platform.
ඔබේ ගමේ නගරේ දේශපාලනයේ හෙට දවස සතිය දිනවල සවස 6:30ට.
What are you doing? I'm going home.
I'll give it another few hours.
Sam! Ah! All right.
Prefect. Tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. on TV1.
If you do not perform, or if you have not performed, and if you do not perform, this is a protest vote we are going to place, and that signal, that protest vote will go down very well, because the government will know that their popularity is coming down and they will have to arrest it.
This government needs checks and balances.
You can't say only winning parties announce their candidates. There have been it has been time and time again where, candidates are chosen.
Our police is still being restructured and reformed at the moment, and that is part of the reason. But I also think organized crime is a bit unsettled at the moment.
Face the Nation every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m.
කන්තලේ මධ්‍ය මහාවිද්‍යාලීය ක්‍රීඩාංගණයට
අප්‍රේල් 19 දවස පුරා
අවුරුදු සිරියෙන් පුරවන්න ඔයාලත් එන්න.
අවුරුදු කුමරා කුමරි බයිසිකල් ධාවන තරගය,
ඔරුපැදීමේ තරගය සහ ජන ක්‍රීඩා රසක් සමග
කුරුණෑගල බැජී සංගීතයට ජනප්‍රිය ගායක ගායිකාවන් ගී ගයන
නැගෙන හිරට අවුරුදු
අප්‍රේල් 19 වනදා දවස පුරා
කන්තලේ මැදි විදුහල ක්‍රීඩාංගණයේදී.
The People's Platform.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. I am in conversation with Mr. Dhanusha Pathirana, noted economist. Now, Dhanusha, while we were on the break, I looked up the Forbes list. There are 925 billionaires in the United States. So you would think that's a country which has wealth. But the gap between the haves and the have-nots is immense, isn't it? You have 925 billionaires, you have thousands upon thousands of millionaires, and then when you go down the scale, you realize that there are tens of millions of people in the US who are simply getting by, or they are in debt, they've got mortgages, they've got jobs which are barely enough for them to make ends meet, and they see all these manufacturing jobs, which are American jobs from American companies, which have gone to China, Vietnam, wherever. because it makes more sense for those companies to make bigger profits to go to countries where the production cost is much lower. So obviously there is the political pressure, because the lower end of America don't understand what happened, and they think, I mean, it's very easy to sell the notion that the Chinese took our jobs or the Vietnamese took our jobs, but in effect it was the American companies, which after all they are in it for a profit, so they moved their production bases more or less. And now the unfortunate thing is, when a country gets rich like this, you've got to upskill your workforce, right? You can't have, you know, let's take a mining company. They can mine much easier, you know, at much cheaper rates in Indonesia, in China, and so on. So why would they pay a higher wage for American labor? So then obviously those people in the US have to, you know, they got to learn new skills and become more competitive. But that simply didn't happen.
Yeah, well, let me comment on that, Niresh. Now, if we look into the deficits of the United States, it is actually not so much with China. Now, if you look into Europe, Europe has an equally large trade surplus with the United States. Now, as we know, Europe, the wage rates are tremendously high, and similarly with Canada.
Yes.
Right?
But then,
how do you understand
just
this?
to interrupt, that was bound to happen because the US has the money.
Yeah.
So where would you market your goods? You know, for Europe, it would make perfect sense to market in the US, not to market in India.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that now, even if you take India, some people say, like, you know, there is cheap labor. I think there I would like to sort of point to a different point of view, because even if we take the Chinese exports into the United States, these are not entirely made in China, Niresh. China right now is running a huge deficit with the East Asians, with the Japanese, with the Taiwanese, South Koreans, Malaysia, Indonesia. These 5 countries run a significant trade surplus with China. And what is this surplus made of? This was actually commented on or written by an American economist, a Marxist economist, in a journal called the Monthly Review. It's a famous journal. So he pointed out about a long time back about what is exactly going on here. Is actually Chinese companies or US companies have moved into China doing all this production and, oh my God, ripping off, as what Trump is saying, the United States.
It's more a global supply chain, isn't it?
It is an absolutely globally linked supply chain, which are dominated by the newly industrialized Asian suppliers like the Japanese, the Taiwanese, South Koreans, and also so much of production is happening from Canada, and there is also Mexico, and not to mention Europe, the Germans. They are running a significant surplus. So these are traditionally developed capitalist centers, and in addition we have Taiwan, South Korea, of course they came up recently, and also Japan. So now what is happening right now is that there is a whole supply chain coming from the East Asians into the China, into Chinese, and then there is a assembly type of work that is happening. So there is very much less value addition. For instance, let's take the iPhone. Mostly the high-tech chips are produced in Taiwan, South Korea, and also to a certain extent Japan. Japan makes the most high-tech component parts. These things come into the Chinese economy and then gets assembled. So actually the deficit is still with the developed capitalist countries and the United States. I mean, let's take another example. How would the Chinese get affected by all these taxes? Now the world would think, my God, now China will get completely hammered, they will disappear, right? But I don't really think so. If you take the Chinese economy, they are close to $18 trillion now. how much are they exporting into the United States? 500 billion. Let's say that 500 billion vanishes, they are going to save hell of a lot on imports from the East Asians, because most of that exports, right? Most of that, what we call the exports from China, they're, they're hammering down on this idea that, oh my God, China is like producing everywhere. No, that's not what is going on. There's so much of supply coming from the Japanese, South Koreans, Taiwans and the East Asians. All that will vanish. If that is the case, at least it won't go through China. So while the Chinese lose out on the export revenue from United States, it will gain significantly by not importing from the East Asians. So the net effect will be even low. And if we even just take even this 500 billion, that's just less than 3% of the Chinese GDP. It's 18 trillion right now. So like I just said, the total loss won't be 500 billion, it will be much less, even lesser than 100 billion. So if you take that, it will be even less than 1% of the Chinese GDP. That is why China went on aggressively. To put this more clearly, Chinese response were more aggressive than the United States. I think United States was shocked by what they did. Not just putting tariffs on US goods coming into China, they completely banned 3 rare earth metals going into the United States. They are going into the United States military industry, electronics and so on, and now some consumer goods products. So if they want to bring industries back down to the United States, that's the US, here we have Chinese controlling 90% of the raw rare earth metal supply in the world. So that is why I am saying this does not look good. This is going into path of confrontation. What we saw, especially the period that led up to the Second World War, there is now a blockade on raw material exports by China. 14 other raw materials have been restricted going into the United States specifically. I mean, they might find other ways to get these through, but regardless of that, this is the path of confrontation, because so many commentators have very clearly pointed out both world wars resulted in, before the period, analyzing the period before the world wars, they were all pursuing these currency warfare, tariffs, import restrictions and all this, and blockade on raw material supplies. So this is the same scenario. We are seeing a repeat telecast of history we saw not so far down the line, and the results were devastating. And just to add one more point, we also need to take into account how United States is right now treating Russia. What is the tariff rate on Russia? 0%. They are not taxing Russians. They are saying, oh my God, we are already put embargoes on them, so let's not take Russia into this, and there is a peace process going on. There is a peace process with Israel also. They slammed down 17% on Israel, well, completely released Russia from this whole fiasco, spectacle.
Which of course is leading to a lot of speculation, especially on social media.
Yes, I mean the only viable reason I could think of is the United States, in case that they see this leads up to a military confrontation, do not want Russia also to get involved, or would like to.
But the age of military confrontation between superpowers, we hope and believe, is over, because they each have nuclear weapons. So it's a no-win situation. You can have wars between non-nuclear nations, or a nuclear nation and a non-nuclear nation, but the nuclear nations have been very careful about this, that nuclear war is basically ruled out. Therefore, these countries, they won't go to war, right? I mean, even India and Pakistan, which are amazing rivals for the last how many decades, but they're both nuclear armed, so there's never any question that they would actually go into a full-scale war. But I get your point that World War II, World War I, and even before that, 19th and 18th century, it was trade wars which led up to, with possible exception of Germany in World War II, but certainly in World War II, with the Japanese situation, it was the embargo on oil by the United States which finally led to the Japanese going to war. So it's trade which has been the impetus to all this.
Yeah, I hope things stay the same way, but the other possibility is that wars could be fought not on their own terrains, like what is happening right now. Now, if we see the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, it's actually a conflict between the NATO superpowers and the Russians, but it's taking place inside Ukraine. So lots of conflicts right now.
The proxy wars. I mean, we've seen this in the 50s, 60s, Vietnam, and so on.
So that is my worry, because countries like us, right? We could be entangled into this, power struggles, which we have absolutely nothing to do with. So, and certain people say even these East attacks would maybe have something to do in that. To that extent, but
that's speculation.
Speculation.
So we'll leave that.
Absolutely,
out
we'll leave that out. So, just to say that we have seen this happen, these tariff wars, and it has not really led to a complete decline of. I mean, let's say what happened to Britain was that it was completely demolished during the Second World War. Whereas the United States was mostly untouched, and it was in the ascending range of their industrial development. Whereas Britain was facing a state of stagnation and saturation due to various conditions which we can relate to the United States also. We can speak about that. But as long as they have a military might, I don't think the United States dominance will. I mean, yes, under Trump it is getting hammered, but in the long run, I don't see the United States disappearing out of being a global player in dominance. And going back to your point about employment, Niresh, I think we'll have to go into the issue of how US capitalism actually works. Now, for instance, let me just go back to a previous point where just to say it is not just the cheap player, because now even in Europe, they have about 20% of their output in manufacturing, which is not so far, there is not tremendous gap between the Chinese. Chinese is about something like 27%. And the Japanese, the East Asians having a similar range. But this United States have a specific problem on its own. So, which we spoke about it in terms of the currency. We can speak about the economic structure also that actually, leads them down this path. So, what we call during the 1960s, these writers came up with the idea that United States is going down a monopoly capitalistic mode of production, where now free competition has ceased. Now it is brands and monopolies that are actually controlling the output and distribution of their wealth. So in a situation like that, what happens is that they don't compete among themselves through reducing prices and making things more cheaper like that. They build brands and they maximize their profits by raising prices gradually and cutting the output. And when you slash your output, what happens is that your employment levels go down, gets restricted. So in order to keep full employment going, but the governments are always being, it's their responsibility to maintain full employment. So debt becomes a part of the whole system, and even if you just forget about the government's role here, the surpluses that are produced by the monopolies has to be reabsorbed, and for that reabsorption there is not enough demand. So therefore we saw these credit cards being pulled out, right? These are like autonomous responses from the system to the fundamental problem of lacking aggregate demand. So credit system expanded through the banking system. So this led to a financialization of that monopoly capitalism. So that surpluses got absorbed into a financial reinvestment sphere, like stock investments, derivatives, and you name it, and options trading. So when due to the monopoly structure, there is a stagnation of demand, the surpluses get reinvested mostly in the financial sphere. So what we call financialization, and specifically we point out a sphere called FIRE, that is finance, insurance, and real estate.
My point here is, and we are almost at the end of the program today. This system which the US has built up, nobody forced it on them into their system, and that has dominated world trade, the world's economy. Is this system now under threat? Let's just say, let's look 1 year from now. Would this current system still be in play, or do you think it will be vastly different?
Well, I mean, to be honest, if you look into the political situation in the United States, I don't see a tremendously egalitarian form of political initiative being built up there. Yes, we see people resisting on streets and so on, but we don't see a real political alternative that works for everybody is being coming from the grassroots. But we see this in Europe, because Europe has a history of struggles, of people's struggles, and their political system has evolved. It has a history of politics. United States was built from scratch. It doesn't have a history. It wiped out the indigenous population, drove them down into these uninhabitable lands, and they occupied the land and then kept on conquering, expand towards the west. So now they don't have this consciousness of the need to go into think about imagining about a more egalitarian political framework, which we see definitely in Europe, but we see its opposite also, the rise of fascist forces. But you only need to look into the level of social security systems which the Europeans have, and even going beyond that, if you take these huge firms in Germany, 50% of their director boards are made out of the trade unions.
So very quickly, Dhanusha, do you see the US weakening and having to change its ways, change its systems over the next year or so?
Well, it's very hard to say, Niresh, because Trump's administration has another 5 years, and if 4 years. So if there's no serious resistance to his way of doing things, I don't see that they will take his step back on these measures that he has proposed. But what I see is that from this 90-day sort of grace period that he has given to all the rest of the world except for the Chinese. He might do something to that extent where give a tax break to everybody. But that is the danger. There is a danger in that to Sri Lanka, because what matters to us is not the absolute tariff, it's the relative tariff.
Yes.
So if, let's say, Trump reduces 10% taxation on all rest of the world, that means our relative difference between India India will be then 16%.
Yes.
I'm just assuming.
Inherent dangers to us. But
is much worse.
Yes. I'm afraid we are out of time today. One good thing about Donald Trump, which is also one bad thing about Donald Trump, is that he does change his mind frequently. So you can't really say that what's happening now with the tariffs will be the same next week.
Tomorrow. Yes.
Okay, and on that note, I'm afraid we need to leave you. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. My thanks to Mr. Dhanusha Pathirana, economist, for being with us this evening and trying to figure out where the world is going. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.
The People's Platform.